Thanks for joining us on today's webinar, the first of our monthly series of webinars. Today we'll be talking about how to prevent the 5 most common violations issued by the South Coast Air Quality Management District. My name is Grant Aguinaldo. I'm a principal here at Envera Consulting. And at Envera Consulting, we simply believe in being a resource to you as we deal, or you deal, with California's air quality regulations. Thank you for joining us. In today's webinar, we'll be focusing on 3 items. We'll look at the most common violations issued by the agency. We'll look at how to prevent these violations. And we'll also look at the cost associated with resolving these violations. But before we get into any of that, let's take a look at a few statistics. Now, all of the data that we'll be presenting here has come from the SCAQMD's prosecutor's office and is all public information. And so anyone can go to the SCAQMD's website and find the exact data that we use to compile the information that we're presenting here. And so the first number that I want to present is the amount that was collected in settlement payments between 2012 and mid-2015. And that is a time period that we had data for. And as you can see, the number amounts to a little over $25 million. The second number is the amount of violations that was issued during the same time period. And so if you simply divide these two numbers, you can get an idea of the costs associated with a violation. But as we'll talk about at the end, this cost is not completely accurate, and we'll actually show you why. So again, all of the data used here is public data. We obtained it from the SCAQMD's prosecutor's office from 2012 to mid-2015. And these data, again, are presented to the SCAQMD's governing board each month during the governing board meeting. And so when we looked at the data, we asked ourselves 2 questions. The first is, what can we learn from the data? Arguably data by itself is not useful, but when you start to look at the data and start to notice trends, then you start to see context. And only at that point, valuable insight starts to be realized from the data that you have. And this is probably the most important point to us, is how can we use the data to help you stay in compliance with all of the SCAQMD's rules and regulations. And so if we look at the data and find patterns in a way that helps you stay in compliance, then we've done our job. So we went through the data, we looked at all the rule violations, and we picked out the top 5 rule violations. And when we did that, what we see is that about 60% of all of the rule violations issued by the SCAQMD are simply for 5 rules. The 5 rules that we've listed here. Now, if we look at the top 5 rules, we'll see that 3 of them are program-based. That is, rules for permits, the Title V program, as well as the Reclaim program. And 2 of them are for source-specific rules, such as gasoline dispensing and diesel engines. Now, if we go even one level deeper, we find that about 50% of all of the violations issued by the SCAQMD are for 3 rules. And if we go yet one level deeper, we find that about a quarter of all of the violations issued by the SCAQMD are related to permits. Now, that's incredible insight because we immediately start to see that violations associated with permits are the most common type of violation issued by the South Coast Air Quality Management Districts. And most facilities, I say most facilities, become regulated by the SCAQMD simply because they have a permit issued by the agency. So knowing all of that, how can we use these data to prevent violations? Or how can you use the data to prevent violations within your own facility? And so if you start to look at these 5 rules, By knowing what they are and what they require, you'll be able to know what to do in order to stay out of trouble. Now, the first rule is Rule 203. And Rule 203 accounts for about 25% of the violations issued by the Air District. Rule 203 simply pertains to permits, and it's theoretically very simple. The rule simply requires that folks have permits to operate in order to operate the equipment at their facility, and the rule also requires folks to follow the conditions specified on the permit. Now, permits issued by the AQMD will have many types of conditions printed on the face of the permit. But of all of the conditions printed and all the conditions that we've seen in the past, there are two conditions that appear on almost every single permit issued by the Air District. And they are these two listed here on the screen. The first requires you to operate your equipment consistent or in a manner that is consistent with the information that you provided in your application. And then the second condition requires you to keep your equipment in good operating condition. Now, in our experience, these two conditions are commonly overlooked, and arguably these two conditions are the easiest way to get a violation under Rule 203. And so let's look at this example. We pull this example from the AQMD's database of all violations issued. And in this case, the facility failed to keep the tank in good operating condition. And as you can see, as you read through the description of the violation, there was a hole in the tank. And so this would be considered to be operating the equipment contrary to the second permit condition, and thus would be a violation of Rule 203. And in fact, we see Rule 203 listed on this violation. Here's another example. And in this case, again, the equipment was operating contrary to permit condition C8.1. And I find it interesting to note here the way that the violation was written uses the exact language from the permit condition itself or the rule itself. And so for the first example, the violation actually notes that the facility failed to keep the equipment in good operating condition, which comes from the permit condition. And then in the second example, the violation says that the facility was operating the equipment contrary to the conditions specified in the permit, and that comes directly from Rule 203. There's a few things that you can do to minimize your risk with respect to Rule 203. And the first is follow your permit conditions. But more importantly, understand what information was included with your permit application when your facility went to apply for the permit. Second, if you have a problematic permit condition, you'll want to get that problem resolved as soon as possible. Sometimes a variance will be needed in order to continue to operate the equipment with a problematic permit condition. And lastly, you want to talk to the folks who operate the piece of covered equipment. By doing this, you'll learn incredible insight about how things are done in the field, and that way you can go back and determine whether or not how things are done in the field are either consistent or inconsistent with the permit condition or the information that we told the Air District about that piece of equipment. The second rule here is Rule 461, and this applies to gasoline transfer facilities and gasoline dispensing operations. So it's gasoline transfer facility and dispensing operations. And most of the facilities that fall under Rule 461 are retail gas stations. Now, 461 has numerous requirements, which include vapor recovery requirements, the requirement to have an operation and maintenance plan, as well as testing requirements, and then requirements to maintain records of everything that you do. So if we go back to the AQMD's database and we pull out a quote common 461 violation, we see that a common 461 violation is typically issued for tears on the hose. In other words, these violations are issued for not keeping the equipment in good operating condition. Again, some of the ways that we can reduce risks associated with complying with Rule 461 include minimizing emissions, keep your equipment in good operating condition, and complete the testing that is required by the rule. And we came up with these 3 recommendations, or these 3 areas, based on our survey or our review of all the specific types of violations that were issued under Rule 461. And again, that's all public information. The third rule is Rule 3002. And Rule 3002 applies to Title V facilities. Now, Title V facilities tend to be larger facilities that are regulated under Title V of the Clean Air Act, and technically any deviation or violation of Rule 3002 can be viewed as a violation of the Clean Air Act. Now, there are a number of requirements for Title V, including, having a proper Title V permit or having a Title V permit. You also have the duty to comply with all the rules and regulations that pertain to your facility or that piece of equipment, as well as complying with all the permit conditions issued to your facility or issued to that piece of equipment. And then you also have a duty to maintain records and provide this information or provide these records to the regulatory agency in a timely manner if asked for. And so in this example here, we find that the violation is issued for a combination of rules, namely Rule 3002 and Rule 1146, because these boilers are covered under 1146 here in the South Coast, or the boilers in this example was covered by 1146. Now, in order to minimize your risks for potential deviations under Title V and Rule 3002, it's simply best that you minimize any deviations or the opportunity or the potential for any deviations, and that you understand the root causes of any deviations that you observe. Again, understanding the root causes is important because only then you're able to prevent any future deviations or repeat deviations. You also, again, you need to follow the conditions in your permit. And more importantly, you need to follow and understand any changes to the rule. Now, rules, the AQMD has a lot of rules, and these rules tend to change rather quickly and can change to somewhat it feels, it could change overnight. And if the rule changes without you knowing, you could arguably be operating in compliance one day and then be operating in non-compliance on the next. And so you want to be sure that you track how the rules or what rules are being amended, and then for those rules, track how, and these are only rules that apply to your facility. You want to track if any of the amendments will affect your operation. The fourth rule applies to the AQMD Reclaim Program. Here in the AQMD, the Reclaim Program is a regional cap and trade program to reduce the emissions of NOx or SOx, or sulfur oxides or nitrogen oxides. And some of the requirements of the Reclaim Program include reporting emissions accurately. Number 2, holding an amount of emission credits or reclaimed trading credits that is equal to or greater than the emissions that you report. And then lastly, and probably most important, you have this requirement of reporting emissions in a timely manner, whether it be daily, monthly, or quarterly. So when we look at the violations for Rule 2004, one of the most common violations is simply inaccurate reporting of emissions under the program. And so a few ways to prevent violations under 2004 are obviously to prepare accurate reports and also maintain good records and monitor your credit holdings so you know where you stand in terms of your credit holdings as well as your emissions at any given point of time during the year. We typically find that under the Reclaim Program, you should aim for reproducibility. And what we mean by reproducibility is that you should keep good records and documentation such that someone who is knowledgeable about the program, and that is the Reclaim Program, as well as your facility, can recreate all the emission reports that were submitted to the agency with very little help. Everything should be documented clearly. Assumptions, emission factors, sources of emission factors, reports, the whole nine. We find that sometimes a single data set can lead to emission calculations that are very different from one another, depending on how the person or how the folks reviewing the data interprets the data presented to them. Now, this is problematic, or it can be problematic, because if you give your data to the inspector, he or she may get a very different number than what you reported, and simply having a different number than your inspector can be viewed as grounds for a violation for not reporting accurately. So you want to aim for reproducibility. The last rule on our list is Rule 1470, which applies to stationary diesel-fueled engines. And these are typically engines driving fire pumps and emergency generators and so forth. The key requirements of 1470 include maintaining records. There's limitations on the non-emergency operation of these engines, which is typically dependent on your distance or your location of your facility relative to a school, as well as requirements about the emissions from your engine. So after going through all of the violations here related to 1470, a common Rule 1470 violation is operating the engine or having an engine that does not meet the particulate matter emission standards simply because the engine was located within 100 meters of a school. And so there are a number of ways to prevent violations of 1470. Most important, maintaining good records, ensuring that your engine operates below the stated hourly limits of the rule, and then also know about the factors that can limit the operation of your engine, like the distance of your engine to a school. And so with that, we're going to talk about the third section, or we're going to move into the third section of our seminar, which would answer the question, what is the cost, or what are the costs associated with resolving these violations? And I'm using the word resolve because sometimes to completely resolve the problem or a violation will sometimes require more than just paying the settlement to the air district. And we'll talk a little about what is needed here. But to really answer the question of how much it costs to resolve a violation, the answer is that it depends. It depends. Like so many things in life, the answer to a specific question is it depends. And it depends on a number of things, such as the length of the violation, the frequency of past violations, the economic advantage gained by operating equipment in violation of a specific rule, and any actions taken to mitigate the violation, among so many others. And so when we look at the settlement costs for the top violations, we see that the first thing, or the most obvious thing to note, is that the ranges are huge. For Rule 203, it's $50 to $8.1 million. The second thing that we notice is that it's really hard to predict the settlement cost for a single violation, because when the district typically settles these violations, they typically settle multiple rule violations under one settlement and one cost. And so again, the data that we have here shows that the settlement costs, or the total, or the settlement costs for a 203 violation can range from $50 to $8.1 million. Obviously, the $8.1 million is on the high end, but it's really hard to determine what is the average settlement cost for a single rule violation. Now, we just talked about the fact that the settlement costs are only one component of the entire cost to resolve an entire or to resolve a violation. And so here we have some of the other costs that folks need to take into account. Sometimes when resolving a violation, it will require you to purchase equipment, and along with purchasing new equipment can come installation and commissioning costs. You could have costs associated with permitting. You could also have costs associated with consultants and attorneys, depending on the situation, There are other costs. And so to really answer the question of how much does it cost to settle a violation, again, it really depends. And it depends on a number of things. And the cost can vary so much that it's very hard to determine the average cost to settle or resolve one violation, because it really depends on the situation amongst other factors. And so as we start to approach the end of our seminar, I want to make a few summary points. And the first is that violations related to permits are the most common type of violation issued by the AQMD. And in fact, a quarter of all the violations issued by the AQMD are for permits. Second, there are things that you can do to prevent violations. And oftentimes, the simplest thing you can do is simply to know what are the factors involved that determine if a piece of equipment can operate in compliance or not. Oftentimes, the best way to ensure compliance is to build a system. That's something that we do, or we focus on with our clients a lot here at Envera Consulting. And then lastly, it can be really hard to predict the cost to settle a specific violation. If you remember from a few slides ago, the ranges can be quite large. So as we said for Rule 203, we've seen settlement costs from $50 to $8.1 million. In addition, the settlement costs are only one of the factors involved with the overall cost to resolve a single violation, and there is almost always other costs that are associated with that settlement. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us on our first ever webinar. And we'd like to invite you to our second webinar, which we'll be having on November 13th at the same time between 12 and 1 Pacific. And on that webinar, we'll be talking about the 5 ways to put an end, or the 5 ways that you can put an end to common environmental compliance problems. And so you can register for that webinar by going to the link listed. And lastly, if you have any questions, my contact information is listed below. Feel free to send me an email. I'll be more than happy to answer your question or provide you some direction to get your question answered. And then we also invite you to stop by our website at enveraconsulting.com. There we have a growing content library, free of charge, and it's a growing list of resources, and soon we'll be having online seminars to help you prepare permits and develop systems, or the systems needed to stay in compliance with California's air quality regulations. Thank you again, and thank you for your time, and we'll see you on the next webinar next month. We'll be talking about the 5 ways to put an end to common environmental compliance problems. Good day.